Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another video. Joe here with Tufel Gun and Armory, and today's video is going to be on the different types of fouling, where it typically accumulates depending on the operating system, and what tools you can kind of use. Now, this is a timed assignment for Sonoran Desert Institute's FTT106. My name is Joseph Marshall. It is June 7th, 2026 at 3 p.m. Started on clearing the 5 firearms that I will be using for this video. Manually operated Howa 1500. Visually and physically inspect, make sure there's nothing in the magazine and nothing in the chamber. Blowback, we're going to be using the Ruger 1022, no magazine in it. Visually and physically inspect the chamber. Semi-automatic rifle, we are going to be using the AR-15, no magazine inserted. Visually and physically inspect the chamber. Revolver, we're going to be using the Taurus 856. All 6 chambers of the cylinder are clear. Lastly, the semi-automatic handgun. We're going to be using the SAR-9 SOCOM, and there is no magazine in it. And visually and physically inspect the chamber, and we are clear. So why is this important? Well, every time you fire a shot, that round travels through the barrel, and you have all these expanding gases that are literally leaving carbon buildup. I'm going to go into an article from Gunworks from April 5th of this year titled "The Science Behind Carbon Fouling, What Really Happens Inside Your Barrel." So when you fire a shot, the pressures can spike tens of thousands of pounds of pressure per square inch, and the temps can reach 3,000 degrees depending on the load in the firearm. This creates a hard layer that becomes more difficult to remove with each shot. And that is important because the more you go without addressing that fouling, the more inaccurate and inconsistent that firearm will be in the long run. So with firearms, you're typically going to see 3 to 5 areas that experience an increased level of buildup and fouling compared to other areas of the firearm. And that has to do with the way the action is designed and what happens in that chamber when you send a round down range. Now, some of these are going to be more universal in the sense that the type of fouling and where it's occurring is going to be generally similar across all platforms. And the biggest one is going to be the inside of the bore. So when that initial ignition happens, when that firing pin strikes the primer and ignites that powder, right there in the chamber and you know, a couple inches forward, you're going to see the most carbon fouling and powder residue there because it's closest to that ignition. Now, further down the bore, as we approach the muzzle, you're going to see a lot more copper fouling or lead fouling or whatever projectile you're using. So with manually operated firearms, in addition to the bore, you also have the chamber, you have the locking recesses, you have the breech face where the round sits, and then you have the firing pin channel within the bolt. Now, most everything from the locking recesses back is going to be just powder residue and maybe some carbon buildup, because this is a extraordinarily simple platform. It rotates forward, locks, rotates back, and opens up. The revolver is another platform that's really easy to identify and mitigate fouling. The 3 areas that you need to look for are going to be this area back here with the firing pin, the cylinder itself, and this forcing cone right here. And this forcing cone is very susceptible to the more material fouling, the copper or lead, because that projectile is having to jump a gap between the cylinder and the bore via the forcing cone. And so it can sometimes, at a microscopic level, nick the forcing cone on its way in. Moving parts that are associated with this kind of fouling pattern are going to be the cylinder. And because it's so open, you're going to have a lot more of carbon fouling and powder residue throughout. The area that experiences the most heat and pressure is going to be the cylinder itself, and that's revolvers. Blowback operated firearms are going to be pretty similar to bolt actions by ways of moving parts, except they're going to be semi-automatic, and they typically rely on the pressures from that ignition to blow back the bolt, open up the breech, and expend that cartridge before feeding the next round. The difference here is that because of that blowback design and those pressures are moving in all directions instead of just out the front until you open it up, you're going to have a lot more powder residue and carbon fouling in here in the action. The moving parts, like I said, are the same. You got your bolt and your firing pin, and the areas of pressure and heat are going to be the same. Right up here in the chamber with the closed breech. With semi-automatic handguns like this striker-fired one I have here, when that striker moves forward and causes that ignition, all that pressure is contained to the chamber, and it's not until that pressure drops that the slide is actually able to move back. You're left with carbon fouling inside the chamber, as well as powder residue in here, in this open area, as well as the breech face. Now, also on the breech face, you're going to have some discoloration and some copper fouling or brass fouling from here, because that pressure is almost imprinting the head of the casing against the breech face. The only moving parts are going to be that striker, as well as the slide as it moves back and forth with each shot, and that tilting barrel. With semi-automatic rifles like the AR platform, you have a really thick chamber wall, because all of that pressure, you have a lot more carbon fouling right here in the chamber. And then these locking recesses in here, you're going to have a lot more powder residue, and that powder residue over time can lead to carbon fouling. That gas that comes back goes right inside this top part of the bolt carrier group. You have a ton of gas and powder residue and sediment sitting in here, and it is very important to keep this clean so that it can seat properly on that gas tube. Other than that, you have powder residue in the action itself, in the upper receiver. That's just going to be light powder residue, nothing important. Just make sure it's wiped down. And as far as the moving parts, you have the charging handle initially. You have the bolt carrier group that's actually reciprocating, the buffer system, and the bolt itself. That is all moving during this cycle of operations and during this process. For tool selection, you always want to have the disposables on hand. Oil and solvent, cleaning patches for whatever caliber you're working with, and Q-tips go very nicely. You also always want to have an AP brush on hand. Some alternatives would be like dental picks. They make various strength picks. Some are more flexible than others, but you also have that as an option. Now, for the bore specifically, you have a couple of different types of bore snakes. You have an actual hard one, and you have snake ones. You also have cloth ones. And they use different types of attachments. So this jag right here, you can use to push the patch through, or you can use the eyelet, put a patch through the eyelet, and pull the patch through. If the fouling is very bad, you could also attach a bore brush to either one of them and pull the bore brush through to break up some of the harder stuff. Now, for things like the chamber, you have something called a chamber brush. Now, especially for like things like the AR platform where you have, or bolt actions where you actually have those locking recesses in there, this wire is excellent for getting in behind those recesses and cleaning those recesses out. Some special considerations is obviously don't use anything too stiff on the bore. You don't want to damage the bore. Your whole purpose for doing this is to keep your rifle accurate by removing the fouling, and if you damage the rifling, then you've effectively nullified the whole job that you're doing. So yeah, that's the end of this video. My name is Joe with Tufel Gun and Armory. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe. It's the best way we grow together. I'd love to hear from each and every one of you. If y'all have any questions, suggestions, comments, whatever. And y'all have a good one. See you next time.